area we will look at will be large group times. This could look very different depending on the type of classroom that you have. If you have a 1 to 15 class, that would look very different than a 1 to 6. So you want to make sure that you block out your large group times before you start plugging in your small groups and your individual work. Something that we often see in self-contained classrooms and in elementary classrooms is a morning meeting. You might have heard this called calendar or circle time, but most people have heard of that. You might also have snack time as a whole group in your classroom. You might have it as 2 small groups, but if it works in your classroom as a large group, you want to go ahead and chunk that off. Anything else that you do whole group, you want to go ahead and block off. Something that we often see is morning work for students when they're arriving in the morning. You could have students arriving over maybe a 30-minute period. And so you want to have something to keep the students that arrive earlier engaged as they wait, because we often say boredom breeds behavior. So you got to keep those guys engaged. Something that you might see for morning work, maybe they're puzzles, maybe they are task boxes. I've also seen a whole group music, brain break type activity where they're dancing and they're getting all of their wiggles out in the morning. So there are a lot of options there. You would just choose something that works for your students. And then perhaps you have a dismissal meeting. Some teachers have a time at the end of the day where they recap what happened during the day and they talk about maybe what's happening tomorrow, but you want to go ahead and chunk that out at the end of the day as well. And then anything that you want to ensure that you have in your schedule, you want to make sure that you have protected instructional time. So if you are doing any kind of whole group academic, any kind of whole group lessons, you want to go ahead and have blocked out here.
Okay, so once you have the master schedule pieces in your zoning plan, and like Jenny said, you have those large group activities in your zoning plan, it's starting to fill in a little bit. The next thing you're going to do is set aside time for one-on-one instruction with those students who need it. And there are several different things that we can address in a one-on-one time. Just to list just a few of them to throw out there, you might need to start working on social skills one-on-one with students. And then maybe after they've mastered that individually, you can move them to a small group for that. You might do discrete trial in a one-on-one setting. Often, if you're doing discrete trial, you will do it in a one-on-one setting. Some people call this different things. Some people refer to it as like IEP assessment time or teacher time. Whatever you call it, there are a lot of different things you can do during this one-on-one instruction piece. When we really start to look at the instruction piece, we have to know our students' needs and identify the learning targets. So like Jenny mentioned before, that student summary is a really helpful tool to make sure that all of the areas of the IEP are covered for each student. You can see on the screen a basic example. For those of you who've been working with us for the last few years, you may notice this example, this form, I guess, the format. We've changed it up a little bit and we'll show you the new one here in a minute. But basically what we're doing is we're going through the IEP, the evaluation reports, any information you have, any data you have on that student, and you're pulling the most relevant pieces for instructional planning onto one document so that you can really look at that at a glance and get started with the planning and covering all of the curriculum areas that your students need. So Jenny's going to go ahead and open up the new form and we'll show you real quick. If you attended the student data folders and student summaries training last month, this will be familiar to you. But it just looks at each area. You can see reading and literacy and then writing on the screen. And so we're looking at the student's most current IEP goal or objective. What are they working on right now in each academic or functional area? What are their strengths and the data sources for those? What are their needs and the data sources? Like, where did you get that information from? What accommodations and modifications do they need? And then is there any assistive technology needed? And there's a room for notes, because oftentimes when you're going through an evaluation report, whether it's speech, OT, PT, or the psych eval, you might jot down notes about like the student's working memory, or maybe that their reading comprehension scores were lower than their basic reading scores, or whatever it is that you want to capture there. There's also room to the far right to note the least restrictive environment for that student for that area. So we know that our students have strengths and needs, as all students do, and you might have a student who their least restrictive environment for reading is the special education classroom, but maybe their least restrictive environment for math is the general education classroom. So just really helping you to think through that and start identifying what you're going to teach and where you're going to teach it. Okay, so we'll look at the zoning plan and think about putting in those one-on-one instruction pieces with the students who need it. So just keep in mind that your time spent one-on-one with students might vary based on your class size, based on your district's expectations, and definitely based on the needs of your students. So you might be working on IEP goals in that time. You might work on specific curricula that you have available to you or that your district is expecting you to use. One example of that is the STAR curriculum. Many people in the state of Arkansas have that curriculum and use it, use pieces of that, such as discrete trial, during a one-on-one instruction block. You might be doing some progress monitoring on some assessments like the QPA or the PAST for those phonics assessments. Or you might be progress monitoring maybe some TeachTown curriculum that you have or something else that you're using in your classroom. Okay, so the next thing that we'll talk about is small group instruction. And this is exactly what it sounds like. You have a small group of students that you're working with all at the same time in the same place. Okay, so one thing that you need to consider is which students are able to work together in small groups. And it's important to think about that student summary that we mentioned earlier and your student needs. Identifying those learning targets. What are those specific students working on? You can see at the top that it says class or time period, and it's really important that we consider small groups in each academic area. So we would want to look at reading, for example, and then take this form and figure out which students can work together in a reading group. Then a separate one for math, which students can work together in a math group. In a writing group, which students are going to be able to work together. And the reason for that is because, as I mentioned earlier, our students have strengths and needs, right, in different areas. So a student may be really strong in math, but they may need more support in reading. So you may not have the same students grouped for each academic area. They may be, probably will be at different levels and need to move in and out of different groupings of students. So this form can be helpful just to kind of look at that. You also may have in your classroom, you may have some behavior needs or some social skill needs. There may be students who just are not able to work together. So you can consider that in using this form as well. And you can see the student initials across the top and down the side. You can just put a check mark for those students that are able to work together and an X for students who would not be able to work together for that subject. And like I said, it could be because of their academic needs, their learning targets, could be more because of behavioral or functional skill needs. And one thing I did want to note is that there are often less than ideal groups in your zoning plan. Like, you won't be able to probably have the perfect group for every single rotation throughout the day. So you may have a group that isn't the easiest to work with, but that's the only option in your schedule at that point. As the teacher, I usually tried to take that group. I didn't usually give that most challenging group to my para. if I was expecting them to get very much done at that station. So just maybe think about that as you think about staffing and who's going to work with each small group. Looking at the zoning plan for small group instruction, there are a few things that we will talk about plugging in here. You could be working on IEP goals at this time. You might be working on district expectations, things like any curriculum that the district is expecting you to do, any, for example, some of the with the RISE initiative, there is some phonemic awareness and some phonics instruction that is expected to happen. And so you might be working on that in small group. You may be working on academic content, which of course could relate back to their IEP goals. And then considering within that, are there OT, PT, or speech skills that could be addressed within their academic targets? Can you pull that in to their academic small group time? You may also be working on functional and social skills during those times. So just kind of covering the basis for whatever your students' needs are when it's appropriate to teach them in a small group. There are a variety of things that you can do during that time. Okay, we're going to talk about completing the draft. And I use the word draft because if you have been following through with us and completing each of those, you've got your master schedule pieces added in, you've got your large group. In your zoning plan, your large group times, you've got individual one-on-one times, you've got some small group times. Now you're very close to finishing your first draft of a zoning plan, which is awesome. So you're going to fill it in one piece at a time like a puzzle. Here are some things we can complete the draft with. It could be independent work. Keep in mind that there needs to be a system for this. And if you're not sure what an independent work system looks like, there's a video in the classroom setup training. There is a video of a classroom setup training in the August folder on our website, and we'll show you at the end where to find all of that. And that explains what an independent station can look like. The skills that students would work on in independent work are skills that they have already mastered that you're wanting them to work on generalizing and maintaining. And those could be skills that are right on that student summary sheet that we've talked about. So you're identifying those learning targets even for independent work time. You need to be sure that you're building in transition time. When you go from the classroom and come back, like when you leave the classroom for recess and come back, that takes a little bit of time. So don't schedule yourself with everything so close together that you don't have time for those transitions. And then functional routines. That may seem like a small thing, but it's very important for increasing student independence. So being sure that there are functional routines built into your day, and that's something that you can add to the zoning plan at this point. Play and social skills are another very important skill set for our students to have. If you teach at the secondary level, you might call this recreation and leisure skills, and structured free time might be an option here. We often do have to teach our students what to do if they find themselves with some free time, but we do want it to be structured with some expectations for what kinds of activities they can engage in during that time. And it's still an important skill to teach. Career and readiness skills at the secondary level are also important, of course, and that can be added in at this point in the zoning plan.
All right, so now you have your first draft. Congratulations, it is a lot of work, but it is worth it. You need to double check. So something that I found I did was I would accidentally put in 2 literacy groups, or I would forget to assign a student to an adult during a time frame. So I created a document and I made sure that all of the staff was in a location with specific students. I made sure that everyone had breaks, everyone had lunches, every student had all of the areas listed in their IEP. You really want the zoning plan to match that student summary in the IEP. And so I did a simple document like this. You put your students across the top, and then all of your areas that they're served in the IEP go in the column on the left. So this is an example. We have a document you can take and make your own in our resources, and you would just plug in whatever the student has in their IEP on this document, and then you would go through the zoning plan row by row and make sure that every student is assigned during that time frame. I used a highlighter so that I knew I had gone through that line and that every student was marked off. But that was personal preference. Do what works for you.